revised agenda. The council will not be taking action on the executive order today, sitting as the council and the Board of Health. That's all.
Thank you. And I also wanted to announce that it's sort of after 3, but it's on our agenda, it says 3, then 2, about the us taking action on the Board of Health. There is no recess scheduled in there. There will be at some point because hopefully we will not run the two parts together. And we would, when we take the recess, at this point we're scheduled to come back at 1:30 for the discussions on the subdivision staging policy. And with that, I'm going to turn for item number 1 to Vice President Hucker, who's also the chair of the Transportation and Environment Committee, to give us a little background. Please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. President. Good morning, colleagues. Today we're talking about the 495-270 draft environmental impact statement. The Maryland Department of Transportation has set a November 9th deadline for comments on it, on that 18,000-page document. The T&E committee met on October 26th and made some observations about the DEIS and the elements of a county preferred alternative, all of which are contained in the draft letter that Dr. Orland has so ably penned, which is on parentheses A through E packets. I want to thank my committee colleagues, Council Members Reamer and Glass, as well as Council Members Jawando and Friedson for providing some feedback on this letter, and the county executive and DOT staff, as well as particularly Director Conklin and Dr. Orland. And I want to thank the Park and Planning Commission for all their hard work on it, particularly Carol Rubin, and the Prince George's executive and council. Council President Turner has been in touch to help us get our position aligned with theirs on this, as well as our federal and state delegation as well. This letter in draft form is really an important document to achieve a consensus among our county leadership and alignment with Prince George's County as well. It doesn't reflect any individual's position, but it does, I think, reflect a consensus view on so many that the draft environmental impact statement from MDOT is wholly insufficient. It's been a while since we discussed this in detail, so without repeating everything from the T&E session, I want to reiterate just a few main points of the letter and then turn it over to Dr. Orland. First, overhanging this whole discussion is the fact that our top transportation planners in the county came up with a diversion, a Maryland 200 diversion that the county executive and the county council unanimously put forward as our best proposal to achieve the project goals and achieve congestion relief in our region. They all agreed on that. It was endorsed by the bipartisan, county MNC PPC and the National Capital Planning Commission as well as our partners in Prince George's County and in Frederick County and officials from municipalities as well. And yet, this great document that achieved so much consensus and put forward a vision for congestion relief was ignored by MDOT and not included in their analysis. The committee then, based on that, rejected the premise that we should just accept their decision and now be boxed in by the alternatives that they put forward while ignoring ours. Since there's been no study, the state's decision hasn't changed any of the facts on the ground or the thinking of any of our county's planners or transportation officials. And so we recommend going back and asking for a further study of the Maryland 200 diversion alternative, as has been our position for nearly a year now. There are also 3 key factors that we didn't know when the MDOT alternatives were drafted. First, we now know what has gone on with the Purple Line. We're very concerned about the collapse and the future of that project. MDOT has not explained the reasons that their previous largest public-private partnership has run aground. And after an unprecedented failure like that, MDOT's still moving forward with a P3 that's larger in scope and complexity without ever conducting or engaging us or the public in an analysis of what went wrong. Second, we know we have very significantly changing travel patterns due to COVID. So MDOT should be cautious, the committee believes, as the COVID-19 pandemic may have caused long-term changes in our travel patterns. There was an important independent study done by the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority that predicts far lower vehicle miles traveled across the region until 2025. Those factors have not been taken into account by MDOT in their analysis. And finally, we also know about the WSSC utility costs. Thanks for a whistleblower bringing to our attention the fact that there might be up to $1 billion worth of ratepayer charges. We know from Maryland Matters that MDOT is engaged in discussions with 21 other utilities that have property in the right-of-way, and that hasn't been analyzed as well. So when you put all that together, we, I think, are back to doubling down on our previous position, asking them to study the Maryland 200 diversion alternative. I want to thank everybody who's contributed to that process, particularly the public and the advocates from the town halls that we held a year ago that over 1,000 people came to. We've had a lot more transparent and active public participation process than MDOT put forward, and I think all the feedback that the public has provided and the advocacy groups have provided have given us a much stronger recommendation. So with that, I'll stop and turn it over to Dr. Orland. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Orland. And Dr. Orland, I've already been asked, and hopefully you will do it this way. We will go through point by point of the letter so that people can comment as we go along rather than try to wait till the end. Okay?
I just want to make one important correction to what Mr. Hucker had said. I didn't write this letter at all. Director Conklin deserves all the credit. He drafted the original letter here, and we made some comments, but it's an excellent letter, I think, generally speaking, and he deserves the credit for that. And I know that today, I know of two amendments or two revisions that are going to be suggested by council members. I think Mr. Friedson has one. I think Mr. Reamer has one. Which we'll get to, I guess, at those points in the letter. Okay, so after the introductory section, really the first part of the letter talks about some of the problems that Mr. Hucker had already identified. So under insufficient alternatives analysis on Circle A, and we're looking at circles A through E, by the way, he referred to the lack of study of the Maryland 200 diversion alternative, which was endorsed by the county executive and 8 of the 9 council members in a letter that was sent to the state a year ago for study, and they really did not take this up as a study amongst the alternatives retained for detailed study. And so we want to keep considering to have that on the table. Also, transit, although there was an explicit alternative, a couple of them in the original alternatives, that wasn't really looked at as the sole alternative to this project. And there's work being done on the side, if you will, with county and state folks to try to determine what a transit element might be and where transit money might go out of this project, but that hasn't yet been determined. On Circle B, confidence in the project and the public-private partnership, not much more to be said on this. The experience with the Purple Line has not been all that positive with the P3, and the concern with this one is that it's a much, much bigger project. And until we can really be comfortable that a project could be carried forward in this, we have some doubts about the P3. Changing travel patterns. Of course, we all know what's happened since March with COVID-19. The project is basically based on forecasts of travel in 2040. So the short-term and even midterm effects really don't necessarily affect what the final design of this ought to look like, because the general idea is that we will get back to some level of normality, even with a new normal of maybe more telecommuting, but in the next 3 or 4 years, maybe sooner. But in the long term, the forecasts were done based on the pre-COVID-19 situation. It may definitely affect when the project gets started, not necessarily what the final form of the project would be. The inadequate purpose and need section is also items that really have been covered so far in the discussion with Mr. Hucker. Under uncertain environmental impacts and mitigation, a lot of concerns here. Park and Planning raised a lot of them in the letter the staff analysis they did for the Bi-County Commission, which is attached to today's packet, having to do with worries about the too tightly constrained level of disturbance definition, particularly with respect to stormwater, noise impacts, air quality impacts not adequately measured or monitored, and several and impacts on community and cultural resources as well. One that came up most recently, of course, is the likely impact on the Moses Morningstar Cemetery just inside the Beltway west of Seven Locks Road. As far as the recommended next steps, these are the items which describe fairly generally what the county would be, what the executive and council would find acceptable. First of all, that the environmental impact statement and the record of decision should correspond with the phase 1 of the project approved by the Board of Public Works. This EIS was done prior to that, and so it covers the entire Beltway and 270 up to 370. However, the phase 1 of the project approved by the Board of Public Works is really just the western part of the Beltway, the west spur, and 270 itself going north, at least the part within Montgomery County. And so the FAIS we'd like to see conform to that scope rather than to the original scope, if possible. The second point is the agreement about substantial and ongoing funding for transit must be reached and detailed in the FEIS and their record of decision for phase 1 and incorporated into the recommended preferred alternative. The idea here is that the commitment of funds would be stated explicitly and that the money would be received by the county or by the state, whoever's going to end up building whatever projects comes out of that contribution, starting from the very first year of operation of this facility, and perhaps even before if possible. The next bullet, this is the first bullet on Circle D. Encroachment on highway facilities towards nearby businesses, residences, and resources into undeveloped areas, the right-of-way will remain a major concern. We don't support expansion of the right-of-way and expect that we'll work with adjacent businesses and residents to minimize potential harm in private property. The next bullet, reversible managed lanes appear to be effective on the I-270 portion from the lane divide where the two spurs meet up to 370. However, the preferred alternative should only be selected after the completion of the next phase of the study, or the next EIS, which is underway, which is I-270 from I-370 up to Frederick. Because until we really know what makes sense in that section, it's hard to determine precisely what should happen between 370 and the spurs. There's a note here about, we note the residents of Rockville and surrounding neighborhoods have consistently expressed concern about unmitigated noise. I want to point out that late yesterday we did get a letter from the mayor and council where they are recommending the no build for the I-270 for mostly because of community and environmental impact reasons. The next bullet has to do with the managed lanes between Virginia and the West Spur, and also on the West Spur itself. In the T&E committee, I pointed out where it appeared that managed lanes would be able to fit, a certain number of them, probably 4 in the section between Virginia, 4 additional managed lanes between Virginia and the West Spur, and the net addition of 2 lanes on the West Spur itself with repurposing the existing 2 HOV lanes as managed lanes. However, again, raising concern to protect the cultural and environmental resources along that section, including Carter Rock Springs Elementary School and the Moses Morningstar Cemetery. And there are concerns about stormwater impact and noise, and also the impact of the direct ramps that would go to and from, particularly the River Road location, that the effect that might have on the cemetery. I think on this point, there was, I think Mr. Reamer, had a recommendation for a change language.
Well, we're going to go back through.
Oh, okay. You're going to go through all the points. Okay,
right.
We'll do. All right.
Yeah.
Fine, we'll do. The next bullet is that if it's retained in the final environmental impact statement, improvements to the Beltway between the West Spur and I-95, in other words, the eastern section of the project, as well as the I-270 East Spur, should be limited only to transportation systems management proposals, ideas, things like ramp metering or perhaps extending an exit lane or an acceleration lane, but not to add a through lane or through lanes on the Beltway. So it remain the 8 lanes that it is now because of community environmental impacts, which are quite severe in that area with any widening. The letter then the next bullet talks about having direct ramps between the managed lanes and River Road, Westlake Terrace, Wooten Parkway, and Goody Drive. This was actually presented to T&E back in June as part of a review of the transit portion of this project, transit aspects of this project. And the council and executive were endorsing these generally. Again, I'm concerned about the design, of course, but the idea of having a direct ramp from these overpasses to the managed lanes would not only encourage the use of the managed lanes by those paying the toll, but also be very useful in terms of being a very fast way for buses to use it. And of course, buses would be using it for free. And it would save the time of having to weave all the way across the lane of the existing lanes, the general use lanes, to the managed lanes to enter them, and then weaving all the way back across to exit. The tremendous time savings to include this.
If I could interrupt you for a second on this one, there's a very important point here as well, in that the DEIS doesn't include any traffic impact analysis on the local road network, so that's embedded in this point as well.
Thank you. Thank you. That is important because some of these connections are to roads that, again, do not connect to 270 today. Goody Drive, Wooten Parkway don't. And there are similar ideas for further up 270 in the next phase of the study for other locations that don't. The reason for that, by the way, is that if it were included with interchanges which have general use configuration too, that makes it a much more complicated design on the bridge itself and could raise some concerns. Again, the next bullet is we support your earlier decision for transit to use the managed lanes at no charge. And there's encouragement to adopt the hot lane policy consistent with Virginia, where 3 or more passengers or people in a vehicle would be able to drive for free and not pay a toll. And then the final bullet at the top of page E, supporting including a shared use trail on the reconstructed American Legion Bridge and detail other pedestrian and bicycle facility improvements to be implemented with this project. I do want to add one more point, which was brought up in the T&E committee, not included in the letter. I'm not sure if it was just an oversight on all of our parts, so I don't include this, but the planning board has made the recommendation over the years that whenever this bridge is reconstructed, that it should be built structurally to be able to accommodate rail, just as the Woodrow Wilson Bridge was basically in the aughts when it was designed and built. The Woodrow Wilson Bridge, there's 2 lanes there where structurally you could put rail on it in the far future if that were ever wanted to be done. So we'll have to ask the council whether or not, and the executive, whether or not they want to include an extra phrase. I think this is the place to put it, as in this bullet, or maybe as a follow-up bullet. And that is the letter. You do include in the packet, you do have the letters that was Mr. Huck referred to from NCPC, a letter from the congressional delegation raising concerns about the Moses Morningstar Cemetery, and also the letter from the Prince George's County Executive and Council that was forwarded to the state early in the week. And again, one of the things the committee wanted was that this letter, the county's letter, Montgomery County's letter, reflect all the same general points that the Prince George's letter does, so we have some coordination here, and this letter does that. So with that,
I'm sorry,
back over to you.
Just so that you have timing, the Park and Planning Commission should have its letter in on the DEIS. We're doing separate letters, one for the DEIS and one for the joint permit application. But our comment letters should be complete and ready for filing tomorrow. So we just didn't have it. We're still going through our final drafts. And
Sure.
If you wanted to, I mean, we'll be submitting them anyway, but if you wanted to include those with your, as an attachment, we'll be providing those to Dr. Burley. So.
Thank you, Ms. Rubin. Mr. Conklin, did you have anything else to add to what Dr. Orland has said? Since you wrote the letter, we might want, since he admitted that you wrote the letter. Yeah, go ahead.
I just realized I was speaking to myself, which happens more often than I'd like.
Yeah.
I think Dr. Orland did a very, very good job summarizing it, and I interrupted in the one place where I felt he left something substantial to the side. So I think the council is good to start discussing the individual points.
Thank you. And Ms. Rubin, did you have anything else to add?
No, I'm good to go along with the comments, and if there's any questions, I'm available. Or obviously, I'm not shy. I'll interrupt if there's.
I know that, Ms. Rubin. I know you. Yeah. Thank you, and thank you both all for being here. All right. So, Glenn, do you want to go back through the letter since you have had some communication from council members? You're on mute as well, Glenn.
Yeah, I got him here. I'm back. I believe it's the two amendments I know that are out there is one from Mr. Friedson and one from Mr. Raymer. So I just turned it over to them and have them explain it, what they want.
Great. Well, let's just so we can all look at, if you're looking at the letter itself on page A, is there any additions, corrections, deletions on page A? So that we can be efficient as we do this. I see nobody jumping up and down. So, okay. Go ahead. Was that somebody? Yes, Tom, go ahead.
I just emailed it to Glenn, but not to be picky, but I think it's an unconventional spelling of dialogue, more appropriate for the internet. Usually has a UE.
All right.
Go on.
To that point, there are some typos and missed periods and things like that. So blanket needs a very careful copy edit.
And I think that's why Glenn said that Chris Conklin wrote the letter.
Not true. fake news. But we've noticed that too, and
we'll advise in a different punch as well.
Thank you, Dr. Orland, for your help.
If I could add one issue on the letter, I would recommend that at least a discussion of the 200 alternative diversion alternative. Just mention the environmental impact, because it was actually recommended in order as an avoidance technique, not just because they'll come back, State Highway will come back obviously and say, well, the transportation, the travel demand, et cetera, doesn't work as well on the 200 alternative, but it's a combination and a balance. It was done not only because we think it meets the needs for travel as well, but because there's such a significant difference between the environmental impacts using the ICC versus 495 expansion.
Well, and I'm also concerned, I mean, I believe we mentioned it here, but I'm concerned that if you use the ICC, an alternative, that I-270 becomes a more crowded highway. And so that is a concern right now, and we're going to get into it deeper into the letter. But right now, because of the pandemic, 270 is a very different highway. But the question is when that will change, and if that will change, and how that will change. So I am concerned about using the ICC as an alternative. Anything else on A? On A. Okay. We're now going all the way to B, all right? Is there anything on B that someone would like to raise? Going once, going twice, okay. We're now going to go to C. Anything on C that anyone would like to raise? No? Okay. We're now on D. On the concern about the right-of-way, and I guess it's I would be the first bullet, the encroachment of highway facilities. I believe that we should say, rather than support the expansion of the right-of-way, or that we don't support the expansion of the right-of-way, it's important to put the word not in there. I believe that we should say something about the existing walls, because my concern all along has been, I don't know exactly whether the walls are at the end of the right-of-way. And if something gets expanded to the right-of-way, it still could be wider than what it is existing today. And that, to me, is a concern. Is there any discussion on that?
I would say that's a discussion also that's involved with Mr. Reamer's motion that he's going to make, but it has to do with 2 bullets further down, sort of the middle of the paragraph that starts "managed lanes appear."
Yep.
There's a sentence that says, "Any work in this area." Now, this is having to do with the section between on the Beltway, not 270, but nevertheless,
Right.
It's same issue. Any work in this area should occur within the existing walls or within developed area of the right-of-way where noise walls are missing. That's
Okay.
the way the letter's been drafted to date.
Well, I can certainly wait for 2 bullets and hear from Councilmember Reamer, but I think that we should discuss it for both parts, not just for the
Understand.
Beltway, but also for 270.
Understand.
Okay. Is there anything else on the reversible managed lanes? Is there any time that we're going to actually discuss that if they do toll lanes, the costs that everyone is so concerned about? I mean, I'm not in favor of toll lanes, but if they have them, and I'm using the word if they have them, we should not be having somebody pay $30 one way. I mean, so at some point, is that going to be mentioned in the letter?
We
to you.
attempted to cover that in the discussion. I'm trying to find where it is. I think it's back in the alternatives where we're furthering disadvantaging those who are unable to afford to use the price managed lanes.
Okay.
That's where it's attempted to be addressed, but it's not at the level of detail you've described.
Well, I think we need to enhance that. I think that's a huge concern.
I agree.
Okay. So is someone making notes to how we're going to
Yes.
If you have a motion, I think we need to discuss it. I don't think it's, anyway, I don't agree that we should be raising the alarm about the cost of tolls, although I like the way that it was presented in this letter.
Hello?
So I'm satisfied with how the letter is framed.
Okay. Well, let me
if you
call
have
on
a
Councilmember
specific-
Glass, who actually is to speak, and then we'll get back to you. Councilmember Glass.
Well, I just wanted to thank you, Council President, for raising a question that I actually hadn't thought of before, and I think that somebody in the community would like an answer to, and that is whether or not the sound retaining walls are actually part of the public right of way, or how far beyond the walls
Are in.
right
How
of
far
way.
are they in the right of way? Yeah.
Absolutely. I assumed, maybe incorrectly, that those walls were the end of the public right of way. So I appreciate you. I just wanted to say for the record, I appreciate you raising that question.
Okay. All right. So go ahead.
The noise walls are mapped in the online mapping for this. They're in a variety of different placements within the right of way. Some of them are right on the edge of the traveled way. Others are far back, and there's generally not a lot of correspondence between where the noise wall is and where the right of way actually ends.
Okay. So is there agreement, consensus that we can include that in there somewhere in this letter, wherever it's appropriate?
So, Scott, I'm sorry. My internet went out. Was there a...
There has not been a motion yet. We approved everything that you didn't like while you were not
Exactly.
here. No, but there's no motion.
Can I just make a general... Are you talking about the noise walls issue? Is that the topic?
Well, no, the right of way, the existing walls, but the right of way, I'm concerned that the existing walls are not at the end of the right of way.
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment on that.
Okay.
I should do that now.
Okay.
Well, I think we've highlighted that is a concern, particularly for residents in Rockville. And I think we have a way to highlight that better for residents near the western spur of the 495. But I don't think it's workable for that to be the county's position, that the existing walls cannot be no one has presented a viable solution that fits within the existing walls. We have talked about the existing right-of-way. That has been the consensus posture, and that could mean that some walls move a bit. We don't know how much because we're not adopting a preferred alternative. But I think to say the walls can't move presents significant unknown problems because, as Mr. Conklin just said, it varies at different places along the route. And, county executive has been talking all along about we ought to do the bridge first. I thought we all agreed that we ought to do the bridge first. You can't make the bridge workable and have that actually a functional solution and then have it connect in with 270 with zero movement of those walls. It just doesn't work. That is literally, it's a poison pill for fixing the bridge. And I don't think we can take the posture that the walls cannot move, along this.
How do we know that the walls are, how close are the walls to the actual right-of-way? Do you know, Mr.
Well,
Conklin?
they're always within it. I know that.
It varies. Again, some situations it's up near really pretty much right at the edge of the right of way. Other places it's not. One area, for example, is that where it's not is on the outer loop between River Road and the and Bradley Boulevard, or where the West Spur takes off, where the wall itself is immediately adjacent to the right lane. There's a guardrail and then the wall right behind it. And the reason why that was done is because Thomas Branch, a stream, runs behind it. And that Thomas Branch is in the right of way, and then the end of the right of way is the other side of Thomas Branch. And at least in an initial look that planning staff and I looked at, it appears that you can't add 4 managed lanes to that section of the Beltway between the existing noise walls, unless you were to cantilever them over the road, which poses all kinds of other community impacts. So, having language which is less than saying must be within the walls, I think is important. Obviously, you want to try to keep it within the walls as much as possible, but there may be locations, and that's one, where it's really not possible
I think the best approach is to give voice to those areas, to Rockville, to those communities. I think we must give voice to those concerns, but I don't think that the county can adopt that as a absolute position that the walls can't move. That is essentially providing a path of total opposition and non-viability.
I don't know why we have to keep 270 and 495 the same way. 270 has a very different, as far as I know, and please correct me if I'm wrong, has a different concern about where those walls are than 495. And we're pretending like it's all one road. It is not. And to me, that is the concern. For 495, first of all, it doesn't run through my district. But for 495, to me, it is a very different concern than 270. And on 270, do we know where the walls are? Is it the end of the right-of-way?
Much like on 495, there's a variety of configurations, and they do an acoustic design based on the topography where the sensitive receptors, which are usually houses or schools, are, and their ability to place the wall at the desired height. So if there isn't a uniform location for walls on either corridor, the intention, I have no expectation that our preferences for this project will be perfectly met as this gets through design. But I think it's important that if we feel an objective is to maintain the locations of the walls, that we express that as a design objective we'd like to see in the preferred alternative. I don't think we'll be able to hash out, which walls can move, which walls can't as part of this conversation, because frankly, the level of design on these alternatives is extremely schematic, and there's still a great amount of work for them to do to figure out what is and isn't possible within the framework that we'd like to see. So I know the executive felt very much like Council President Katz on this and wanted to take a strong position about the location of the walls and work within the walls, but I think it's important to recognize that there may be instances where that can't be 100% attained, and that's why it's phrased as should rather than must in the paragraph here. But if there's further change to that needed, I'm happy to work with council on what that might look like.
Okay. Well, we have a couple other council members that want to speak. Councilmember Friedson, please.
Thank you. I got to be honest, I'm a little confused as to what we're doing here. If we're editing, editing a letter on the fly in a meeting, which, I'm fine with, or if we're changing the county's, adopting a policy on behalf of the county on the project, or a combination of both. I wouldn't be comfortable if we are looking at, changing what the policy is for us to do it today. I think that, that needs to be considered and thought through. We don't have a lot of time for that since these comments are due on the 9th. I mean, right. I had sent around my edit, which I spoke with Chair Hucker and Director Conklin and Dr. Orland about, my team, and they did. It's a relatively modest edit that just makes sure that we're using similar language for the east and the west side of concerns that we have, and unacceptable conditions that we've determined specifically related to impacts on communities and on the Moses Mourning Cemetery, as was noted. I've sent that around. I didn't know that we needed to make formal motions, but if we're making formal motions for edits to the letter, I just wanted to get clarification on that, or if my edit that I had sent previously had already been accepted.
Well, that was Councilmember Reamer's suggestion that we do formal motions, but I believe we need to have a public discussion on this letter, and that's why, to me, this is the way we're doing it, point by point. But unless I have not heard anyone who is not in agreement with what your suggestion was, and if that is the case, do we agree with Councilmember Friedson's edit by consensus? Seems like silence is golden here, council members. So
great. Okay. Well, I appreciate that. And I would just say, in terms of, I'm comfortable with, the delicate balance that Mr. Conklin attempted to achieve here, which is not easy on a very complicated project with 10 elected officials that have to agree. I think if we make significant changes to that, I think we have to really think through what the implications of them are, and I'd be a little bit uncomfortable with making significant substantive policy-based changes to that without further deliberation and thought, and I'm not sure we have the time to do that. Thank you, Mr.
And I appreciate that. Councilmember Rice.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. And so let me just throw a little thing in the mix here, because I do certainly understand your concern. And, oftentimes we've used the wording wherever practicable, something along those lines, would certainly allow us the flexibility in saying, look, we want this to happen wherever it feasibly can happen. And it actually brings about what Mr. Conklin was talking about, where sometimes it's just not practical to be able to stay within the walls. There will be other examples as well, but if you leave that as the guiding principle, that we want to stay within the walls, but then in some areas we know that we won't, just simple language like that helps to make that happen. So just wanted to throw that out there for some sort of possible consensus.
And I believe that that's probably the correct step. I go back to the governor, though, when a couple of Labor Days ago, when he said publicly that they were not going to go out. I'm talking about 270. In fact, he might have been talking about 495 as well, but I know he was talking about 270. When he said they would not go outside, he said, I believe, existing right-of-way, and then the concern became, where is the existing right-of-way in comparison to the walls? Councilmember Albernas.
I understand both concerns. I think that Director Conklin in the language with should, I think addresses a lot of that, just to leave that flexibility, but make clear the county's position on this. But I also agree that making the changes on the fly is a challenge. So I think I'm where Councilmember Rice is on this, and whether that's amending the language to make even more clear that our strong preference is that we not move the walls, but not be so rigid as to unintentionally create delays or problems that are going to further cost money and further exacerbate challenges with what is already a very complicated project. Then obviously I think we need to strike that balance. So I'm comfortable with the existing language, but if we need to amend that to make it even more clear, I'm open to it. But I don't want to, for lack of a better term, just put a complete retaining wall here on this discussion. Thank you.
Oh, terrible. We're going to give you a smile on that one. If it meets with the council's approval, I'm fine with Councilmember Rice's suggestion as well, to say where it's practical or practicable, whatever. But I do believe we need to make the point again and again, because they made the point and then reneged on it, that they weren't going to do this. So if possible, I think that would be something that should be worked out. Okay.
I think that's a reasonable solution. I just want to emphasize that it is important that we state the constraint we're looking to have here, because if we leave it wide open, the state will look to use the entirety of the right-of-way, independent of what impact that has on the adjacent property. So keeping in here that we want to keep the walls as the barrier for them to play within in terms of the configuration of the road is our primary objective, is I think a very important point, but we don't want to, have that be completely unattainable if there's a location. There are a couple locations where the wall is immediately upon the edge of the road on both sides, which I think the should recognizes that will be, that needs to be changed in that location, but we definitely want to keep the view of a constraint on the design in place here. So I think what Councilmember Rice, maybe with the word maximum in it, is probably a reasonable way to go.
Okay. Councilmember Friedson, please.
Yeah, I appreciate this suggestion, and I'm not sure I have a concern with it, but Mr. Conklin, could you just explain substantively what is the difference between the language that you had proposed and the language that we'd be changing it to from a substantive perspective?
I don't think it is. I think it is pretty much the same thing. It's just additional emphasis that that there may be some change. Should to me implies that that it, in almost all circumstances, needs to meet that requirement, and to the maximum extent practicable, I think loosens that a little bit, because practicable is a standard that's a little bit different, or it's at least defined. Should doesn't have that qualifier on it.
Okay, so just a stylistic change that emphasizes it differently. Okay, I don't have an issue. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Reed.
Thank you. So my understanding is the executive's initial proposal was that it was must and not should.
That's correct. The executive opinion is that putting a significant constraint on this is in the best interest of the public and the adjoining property, because it will force MDOT to constrain their thinking about how this and come up with more creative solutions that allow the facilities to fit within the limits that we set.
Like essentially a land bridge that has the highway 50 feet up in the air. I'm sure that'd be great for the neighborhoods, nearby, right?
We don't have
any
specific design to respond to right now. We have a bunch of sketches that are all based off the same general concept and are just slightly different widths.
Thank you. I thought Councilmember Rice's point was a good one. And having this public discussion about what should means is helpful. So I'm a lot more comfortable. I think, belts and suspenders would be fine. But I think it's an important distinction that we draw, that it's not an absolute, issue, and we understand. Okay. So I think there's a consensus of the body as far as I can tell, and I agree with what I have heard.
Thank you. King Solomon Rice did a very good job on this one. He really did. Okay, so we're still on. Yes, go ahead, Don.
I just wanted to just add that from a context perspective, these are the issues. This is an issue that will clearly come up during the mandatory referral. So, that's the next kind of major point is that these kind of what I'm saying is that the commission will take this statement, understanding that that's an issue that we'll look at closely, keep in mind during mandatory referral, because there's also going to be reconstruction of certain walls to deal with the additional noise. So we have to address it, but we'll take that direction from the council in our review.
Thank you. Council, Dr. Orland, please.
Yes, if I could add, the first 3 bullets on Circle D have to do with what the council and the executive think are okay to do in terms of improvements in the 3 different sections we've talked about, the western part of the Beltway, the part of the 270 north of the lane divide, and the I-270 West Spur. Right now, the language about the noise walls is only in the section having to do with the Western Beltway. And taking Mr. Cass's point, I think we'd want to apply that same point to all 3 sections. And so maybe my suggestion would be, and work with Chris on this, is take that sentence out of the 3rd bullet on Circle D and create another bullet right after it, which says in all of the above, wherever there's improvements, then not just any work in this area, but any work in any of the areas where there's a widening should occur within the existing noise walls, or et cetera, as opposed to just applying to the Western Beltway.
I think, Glenn, this goes very well in the first full bullet on that page.
Okay. However it's conveyed so that it applies to all the sections is my only point, really.
Okay. All right, we're still on D. Is there anything else on D? Hans, Councilmember Reamer, where was your...
Well, I think the issue I had has been addressed satisfactorily, but just in a different way. So
okay.
I think what we've discussed achieves that goal.
Okay, all right, good. So is there anything else on D? Council Vice President Hawker.
Thank you, Mr. President. Sorry, I'm struggling to text you here. I should have obviously thought of this during the T&E hearing, but reflecting on the debate around the businesses that have been financially harmed by the Purple Line, just spitballing here for the sake of discussion, in the last sentence in the first paragraph about, there's relatively unenforceable squishy language about we expect that you will work with adjacent businesses and residents to minimize potential harm. I'm sure the state would say they are working with businesses on the Purple Line route to minimize harm, even though it's not very meaningful. And the state legislature had to pass legislation, creating a fund that still hasn't been implemented. I'm wondering if there'd be any advantage in putting a marker down here that we expect financial losses to be compensated by the state. Chris or Glenn?
That would be consistent. Really, don't know. Chris, have you talked with the exec about that?
I haven't. It's a pretty different type of project than the Purple Line, but I don't know that he would have any opposition to that point at all.
Did we consider with our Purple Line position?
I'm comfortable with that. And I'm seeing head shake, so if we can include that. Now, the other thing is on the second bullet, we note that the residents in Rockville and surrounding neighborhoods have consistently expressed concerns about unmitigated noise from the existing highway, and they have expressed opposition to the physical expansion of the highway. Since we've gotten a letter that they are not in favor of, they were in favor of a no build, and since we're specifically mentioning them, should we also mention that Rockville, the city of Rockville, is asking for a no build, or how does that work? Since we're mentioning them here, and then they also have their own position.
I would say that they will make their own position clear to the state directly. If it causes a bit of a conflict for us, if we were to include their letter in our letter, it would seem to suggest that the council and the executive are in favor of the no build, which this letter doesn't say that.
I appreciate that, but the fact that we're mentioning them specifically here either we should give the complete information or we shouldn't. I mean,
Well, actually, we're hearing some of the same concerns, frankly, for people who live in other parts of this project, which are not in Rockville. So, we could actually just say we note that residents, period, rather than saying in Rockville, because we've certainly had these concerns from Card Rock Springs. We've had these concerns from other locations along the Beltway. Where this is the case.
Specifically referring to 270, the majority of
Right.
And the surrounding neighborhoods is trying to capture the Potomac and other unincorporated areas that have also expressed these concerns. I don't know that there's a problem with us noting that the city has separately submitted a letter here.
I would feel more comfortable if we did that, because I don't think we're giving the full discussion here or full information here of what Rockville is saying.
Again, the only concern I would have is, does that imply endorsement of the Rockville's position?
No, I don't. Well, Councilmember Friedson.
Yeah, I mean, this is our letter. They're an independent municipality under state law. They have the same, rights and obligations that we do. We're both political subdivisions of the state. I think I actually think it's somewhat inappropriate for us to speak on their behalf. I think, they are speaking on their own behalf and are fully capable of doing so. I would say if we're going to do that, we should just either not reference it to Rockville as was noted, or just delete the notation altogether, just delete the sentence. The purpose of this was supposed to be to, express that there are concerns by residents. And, I think it's, I don't have a problem with it as listed, but I think that if we start noting certain groups versus others, there are lots of civic associations that have sent letters with formal positions. There are lots of entities that have done so. And I'd be a little bit concerned about, one, trying to speak on behalf of a municipality that is speaking on its own behalf, and number two, picking and choosing whose letters we are noting and whose letters we are not, which I don't think is particularly appropriate, although I do appreciate the thought process that Council President is putting forward.
Thank you. Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would agree. I think that it's definitely going to be problematic in relationship to those other neighborhoods, civic associations who we are not specifically mentioning. And given that the city of Rockville, as it was stated, obviously has its own process to do the advocacy, I don't think it's not equitable in that way, is that a lot of civic associations don't have that opportunity, but the city of Rockville does. And I believe that if we start being so particularly prescriptive in who we are including by name, we run the risk of, backlash from all those other neighborhoods and civic associations. So I'm not in favor of making it that prescriptive. I can't recall that we've ever kind of done that before. So I really don't think we should start now.
Then I think we should probably take out the reference to Rockville in that sentence.
Yeah.
Is that okay? I mean, because they are sending their own, and I don't want to give the impression that this is saying what Rockville wants us to say. So can everyone live with that one?
I was referring to Rockville as a general location rather than a jurisdiction, and there's no problem removing in Rockville and just referring to referencing surrounding neighborhoods.
Is that okay with everybody? I think we're better. Yes, we're getting a thumbs up. We're moving when we have a thumbs up. All right. Anything else on D?
Okay. We are missing a period at the end of the third to last bullets. We'll add that.
Wow. Mr. Conklin, did you hear that? That he wanted another thing? I mean, I'm just, not that he wants to start trouble.
Somebody that I'm trained as an engineer, and I find this writing to be of exemplary quality for somebody trained as an engineer.
Wow. Okay, we're going to move on from that real fast. And now we're on E.
And this is
your suggestion about the rail.
Right. That I just don't know if the council wants to consider adding that or not. Again, the point being the planning board has recommended over the years that whenever the bridge is rebuilt, that it be built structurally to be able to accommodate rail, just to leave that option open in the long-term future.
Okay, Councilmember Glass.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yeah, if we are investing in our infrastructure to accommodate the growth that we have and the growth that we expect, we need to build for the future. And that absolutely means that we need to include some capacity for public transportation, whatever it might be. Transportation systems that we have today or ones that will be created in the future, but it would be foolish if a new bridge did not include public transportation.
I'm in agreement. Council Vice President Hucker.
Thank you. I agree with that point, and I didn't move quickly enough, but I think since we're doing the copy edits, I think paragraph 5, bullet 5, I think it's better to do numbers rather than bullets, is in a different font with an extra space. But then
right.
I wanted to ask you, Chris, you referenced transportation systems management. Not everybody knows what that means, and we have specifically asked them to consider what you mentioned earlier, both ramp metering and use of the shoulder during peak periods. Is there an advantage in including that specifically so that they don't come back and say, we did this minor approach that you don't care about to transportation systems management, but we ignored your top 2 suggestions?
I don't have, I'm sorry, I was trying to get up here. I don't have much concern about adding more detail on the systems management type approaches we'd like them to look at.
Okay.
Great.
Council Member Reamer.
Just want to say I really agree here. I think we ought to ask for rail. I think I've been working with the High Road Foundation. One of the ideas we've been exploring is whether monorail could be part of this phase. And, that would potentially require less width. So, I think we ought to keep the heat on the state and see if we can't get to something innovative here. And if we don't do it now, it'll be impossible in the future. So let's make it happen. I think this is important language.
Okay. I think there's consensus on that. Okay.
Can I make clear that, again, the planning board's comment was just that the bridge was to be made structurally strong enough to be able to carry rail. It doesn't necessarily add width or add any other dimensions to the bridge. It's silent on that point. Just as it should be more structurally. I'm just make sure everybody understands that's what at least the proposal from the planning board is.
Okay. Everybody all right with that? Anything else on this letter at this moment? Okay. Well, we got through the letter. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who's been involved with this letter. We obviously needed to have this discussion, and we appreciate everyone's thoughts. So.
Mr. Katz, can I say one last thing? I apologize.
Yes,
I think, and I haven't talked with Chris about this, but I think what we should do is, Chris is going to redraft the letter. We'll look at it. And I think we should circulate it one more time to each of the council members, hopefully tomorrow, just to make sure everything is nailed down, T's and crossed and I's are dotted. And then we would mail it out either tomorrow or Monday.
Okay. And it has to be there by the 9th, right?
Well, I don't know if it has to be there by the 9th, as long as we send it by the 9th. We'll email it.
The 9th is the deadline. However,
the 9th is the deadline. Yes.
Okay. All right.
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. The next item that we're having, we said we wouldn't start till 11. The Board of Health Regulation, and of course the public hearing is going to follow it immediately afterwards. So we certainly can't do that before 11. But do we want to have any of the conversation about the Board of Health regulation before 11, or should we wait for everything until 11? Is there a...
I would suggest we wait just because people might likely tune in to watch us. And I think there's been enough issues with this one, not having enough time for the public.
Right. Okay. I'm in agreement with that. I just wanted to double check with everyone. So right now, we're going to have a recess until, why don't we say until 10:55, so everyone can get back and we can actually start at 11. So we're going to have a recess until 10:55 and then come back and sit as the Board of Health. Thank you all. See you all at 10:55. Thank you.